as I introduce my next guest. I believe my guest would agree that for me to say that Washington, D.C. is a very interesting and complex city is an understatement of dramatic proportions. According to the notes on the back of his latest book, quote, there is a fundamental contradiction in U.S. imperialism. The capital of this empire for decades has had a majority black population, which in turn has created favorable contradictions, not only for the erosion of the pestilence that is racism, but the flourishing of the antidote that is radicalism. For further insight into this, let's turn to my next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital: Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C. from 1900 to 2000. He is, of course, Dr. Gerald Horne. As always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So some of these questions might wind up being a bit repetitive, but Revolting Capital, why that title?
Well, if you think about it for more than a nanosecond, you'll quickly see that that phrase, revolting capital, has about 3, 4, 5 different meanings. Mm-hmm. That is to say that the capital of the United States has oftentimes been in revolt. Most famously in 1968 after the assassination of Martin Luther King, but also shortly after World War I, over a century ago, when the father of Black history, Carter G. Woodson, was almost lynched on the streets of Washington, not far from his office, which was, of course, close to Howard University, the center of this book in many ways. And then revolting capital in the sense that capital, that is to say, the ruling elite, oftentimes has been in revolt against the Black community of Washington, which is one of the many reasons why democracy has not descended upon this territory as of yet. That is to say, that unlike most people in the United States, Washington does not have 2 U.S. senators to defend their interests in Washington, D.C., of all places. And then revolting capital in the sense that Washington is rather revolting in a sense that I'm here now, and the homeless population in this supposed most wealthy nation on planet Earth makes this capital rather revolting, I'm afraid to say, rather disgusting, not the people themselves, obviously, but the conditions to which they are subjected, which leads them to seek shelter on the sidewalks. So Washington, in many ways, is a revolting city, and that is part of the story that I tell in this book.
In fact, you're saying that reminds me of the brilliant song Washington, D.C. by Gil Scott-Heron. And he opens symbols of democracy pinned up against the coast, outhouse of bureaucracy surrounded by a moat. Citizens of poverty are barely out of sight. The overlords escape in the evening with the people of the night. And it's deep. I should have probably started this with that. But anyway, those lyrics may not have the glitter or the glamour of LA, may not have the history or the intrigue of Bombay, but when it comes to making music and sure enough making news, people who just don't make sense and people making do. I mean, he's throughout this entire song, he's highlighting the contradictions of Washington, D.C.
Most certainly. And I think it's important for the audience to recognize that there is a longer history of how we reached this point. What I mean is that Washington was a center of enslavement of Africans. A major slave trading entrepot was not far from the capital, in fact. Obviously a contradiction. And it was quite common for enslaved Africans to be shuffled through the streets of Washington in chains. At the same time, the leaders of this nation were proclaiming that this was some sort of empire of liberty, as they put it. And so with the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and particularly after the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, you had a fast break of Africans from Maryland, from the Carolinas, from Virginia into Washington, helping to fortify the pre-existent Black population. And then a few years after the U.S. Civil War, you had the formation of Howard University, which then begins to attract many students, not to mention faculty members, et cetera. And Howard University continues to play a preeminent role in this city. And as I suggested a moment or two ago, has played a preeminent role in this book. But even though I'm stressing in this book the Black history of Washington, what's interesting about Howard is that, to cite one example amongst many, during the Jim Crow era, that is to say the era leading up to about, say, 1965, Washington also attracted, Howard University in Washington attracted a number of Iranian students. Indeed, Howard University was a hotbed of Iranian dissidents before the Iranian Revolution of 1978. And in fact, part of the story that I tell in this book is this question of internationalism, because once Howard began attracting Nigerian students, Jamaican students, et cetera, and once these nations, Nigeria, Jamaica, et cetera, began attaining independence in the midst of a Cold War with the Soviet Union, the United States had to worry that these Black students would be treated like US Negro students. And that would not be conducive to winning hearts and minds in Nigeria or Jamaica. In fact, I cite incidents in Washington during this era when Nigerian students were arrested by the Metropolitan Police, and rather than being manhandled and roughhoused like US Negroes were traditionally treated, you had members of the State Department coming to their rescue, their embassy staff coming to their rescue, that is to say the embassies of Nigeria and Jamaica, for example, come to the rescue. And this at once helps to erode Jim Crow, because, believe it or not, it's not easy to distinguish a Black Jamaican from a Black US national. And at the same time, you have these nations, dozens of African nations, particularly after 1960, 1963, seeking mansions in Washington to construct embassies. This is outraging the affluent Euro-American population, and it helps to contribute to this anti-Washington psychosis, which is still part and parcel of the ethos of the U.S. right.
You mentioned this at the top, but I'd like for you to elaborate. You opened your introduction by describing an attack on an African-American man in 1919 near Howard University, and it was witnessed by Carter G. Woodson. And then from there, you go to 1968 when D.C. was, as you write, convulsed in the aftermath of the assassination of Dr. King. And do you open your introduction with those two events to demonstrate the favorable contradictions, not only for the erosion of pestilence, as in the attack on the African-American man in 1919, that is racism, but the flourishing of radicalism, as in the response to Dr. King's assassination?
And certainly that's the case. And I should also say it obviously illustrates the theme of Revolting Capital, so to make that point. But I should also say that 1968, it's difficult to really describe the profundity of those events, because you had traffic jams from hell as a result of workers in the center of the city seeking to escape what they thought was the spectacle of these Black Americans rampaging through the city. And therefore, those perhaps trying to get from the Pentagon to the White House to consult on bombing Vietnam were stymied. The communication system of Washington also was frustrated, not only in terms of this ascertainment that the police could not necessarily communicate with other law enforcement officialdom, because, as I stress in the book, Washington is one of the most heavily surveilled cities on planet Earth. That is to say, you not only have the Metropolitan Police and the police departments surrounding Washington and Maryland and Virginia and Arlington and Alexandria and Prince George's County, Maryland, all stretching all the way to Baltimore, which is only, 3 miles away. But you also have the Capitol Police, the Park Police. You have the Federal Bureau of Investigation headquartered in Washington. You have CIA, NSA, DIA, military intelligence, military bases festooning the Capitol. You have quite a bit of electronic surveillance, for example. And so when there was this breakdown in communication, which was designed to surveil and monitor the local population, there was real fear amongst the elite in Washington that the city was on the verge of a breakdown. And for those who are still mulling the idea of the strategic importance of Washington, keep in mind January 6, 2021, when insurrectionists felt that if they could prevent the peaceful transfer of power, they could seize control of the empire illicitly and illegitimately. And to be frank with you, if you say January 6, 2021, you'll quickly find out that they came within a whisker of succeeding.
I'm glad you brought up January 6th, because once you said that Washington, D.C. is the most surveilled city or one of the most surveilled cities on the planet, I wanted to deviate because to January 6th, because since that day, I have been saying, with DC being the most surveilled or one of the most surveilled cities on the planet, there was no way in the world that event could take place without the powers that be clearly knowing that it was coming and deciding to either look the other way, underestimating what was on the horizon, or some combination of the two. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, certainly it's no secret that U.S. military officialdom is heavily festooned with ultra-rightists. It's no secret that U.S. national security forces, police forces, etc., are heavily festooned with ultra-rightists. We all know at this point that in the run-up to January 6th, many of these ideas, many of these notions that we now have seen come into being in terms of the interruption of the peaceful transfer of power, they were downplayed because many who were supposed to be monitoring the situation were simpatico with the insurrectionists. And so they did not necessarily have a problem with that. I mean, of course, you see that even today with if Mr. Trump returns to office in January 2025, he's made it clear that he's considering pardoning all of those who have been jailed. And don't be surprised if that takes place. And so when I speak about Washington being a heavily surveilled city, I'm focusing heavily upon those who are perceived as perpetual dissidents. That is to say, the Black American population, which tends to vote against the right 9-1, which is an obvious contradiction with regard to this being a nation where the right wing exercises undue power and influence. I should also say that Black Washington also had the disadvantage of having to confront face to face the most hardened and stubborn and obdurate of the white supremacists and Jim Crow, meaning that in Alabama, North Carolina, Texas, et cetera, when it came time to send their representatives to the nation's capital, these were the individuals, were the men, they were mostly men who they were sending here. People like Senator Bilbo of Mississippi, who was so notorious that he's been represented in a number of Black American blues songs and Black American folklore.
I'm sorry, could you start that sentence again, please? Because there was a slight glitch in the you were talking about those Southerners coming to Washington. Could you just start that sentence again, please?
Well, As noted, Black Americans in Washington had the disadvantage of having to confront face to face the most stubborn and hardened white supremacists. These were the men, mostly men, who were sent to represent Texas and the Carolinas and Florida in Washington. And I reference particularly Senator Bilbo of Mississippi, who was so notorious that he has been subjected to Black American folklore and song. And so in some ways, Washington for Black Americans represented all of the most entangled contradictions and tensions of white supremacy, exploitation, of oppression.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Wilmer Leon here, and Inside the Issues is where you are, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. We're talking about his new book, and when I say new, I mean new. It's been out, what, about 10 days? 2 weeks?
Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, folks, I got it. Revolting Capital, and have read most of it. Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000, by Gerald Horne. And right now, Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. We're discussing his book, his new book. I mean, right off the presses. In fact, my book is still warm. Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. I'm sure you're going to get this question a lot, but I'm going to ask it for a slightly different reason. I have a lot of your books in my library. A lot of your books. You've written a lot of books. I don't have them all, but I got a lot of Gerald Horne. I got a whole damn shelf of Gerald Horne in my library. And you write on what many would say are these incredibly obscure things, but your research is just phenomenal. And so by the time you're finished the book, you reading the book, you go to yourself, well, damn, why didn't I know about this? Why didn't I think about this? Why didn't I? And so what was your motivation for what was the spark that you said to yourself, I'm going to write about this? Because again, as I'm reading your book, I thought about Dr. Clarence Lusane's book, Black White Capital, Black, what is it? It'll come to me in a second. Anyway, about Black History of the White House. That's what it is. Black History of the White House, where he wrote about the enslaved Africans that helped build the White House and what was transpiring in Washington from that time till now. But what was your motivation for writing this book?
Well, I first started visiting Washington, D.C. when I was a teenager. Mostly, I have to confess, for social reasons, party reasons at Howard University, for example.
Good reasons.
Sorry?
Very good reasons.
Oh, I agree. But then over the years, I began coming here to do research because Washington, among other things, is a research mecca. Mm-hmm. National Archives of the United States are here. Howard University has a plethora of sources on Black American history. The Library of Congress, which has the NAACP papers, which is a tremendous collection. And so the idea occurred to me that perhaps I should look into Washington because in my business, that is to say, writing history, you need sources. You need primary sources, preferably, in order to write history. And I quickly ascertained that Washington has a surplus of primary sources. And I should also say that on my research agenda, as we speak, is going back to the days of slavery, because I'm going to do a book on slavery in Washington. I've already written about what happened in August 1814, when the British invaded Washington, torched the city, torched the White House, joined by a number of enslaved Africans who then escaped on British ships to Trinidad and Tobago, then a British colony, where their descendants, the Blacks' descendants, continue to reside. And I suspect, once I dig into the sources, that I'm going to find a number of efforts by certain embassies to express, shall we say, abolitionist or anti-slavery tendencies on behalf of the enslaved population in order to gain an advantage over this rising power known as the United States of America. Washington is also unique in terms of slavery because the slave owners in Washington were the only slave owners who were compensated when emancipation came and their property was nullified and liquidated. Indeed, one of the sub-themes of the book In Your Hands is that part of the reason why Black Americans have been treated so atrociously in this country and in this nation is because we were property. And when abolition came, there was no compensation to people whose property was taken. Now, of course, the debate now is about reparations to the descendants of the enslaved, but the descendants of the enslavers are still furious about the fact that their property was taken without compensation. And not only that, but then the descendants of the property still walking around acting in their estimation in a cheeky fashion, not necessarily giving the descendants of the enslavers the respect that they think that they're due. And that creates a certain kind of combustibility that explodes from time to time in this nation's capital.
You write, what served to define Washington was not only the overwhelming presence of the federal government, but as well the existence there of universities, Howard in the first instance. How has the existence of the federal government and the existence of Howard University defined D.C.?
Well, Howard, in the first place, it has a law school, and Charles Hamilton Houston is the late famous dean of the law school, who helped to train a cadre of civil rights lawyers who then assaulted the foundations of Jim Crow with some success. It also had a medical school. And so this creates, speaking of songs, you're probably familiar with the song by the folklorist and bluesman Leadbelly about Washington, D.C. being a bourgeois town. Because Washington, D.C. Had more than its share of Black lawyers when that phenomenon was not necessarily as prevalent as it is today. Black medical personnel, doctors, dentists, et cetera. But at the same time, you have a city where Black people are generally absent from the corridors of power. In fact, the Black employees of the federal government for the longest time in Washington were either elevator operators. They were some of the few Blacks who had a certain kind of upward mobility simply because they operated elevators, not to mention those who were cafeteria workers. And still in Washington, a disproportionate percentage of the cafeteria workers serving on Capitol Hill, for example.
Oh my goodness.
Or Black Americans.
You are correct, sir.
And
let me put a pin right there and add. In '83, I was an intern for Congressman Robert Matsui from Sacramento, and so I was here in Washington, and if you walked around the halls of the Cannon House office building where his office was, it was one reality. But when you took the elevator down into the basement, where the cafeteria was, where the print shop was, where the cutting room was, all of the services that are there for the members of Congress, that's where you saw Black DC, was in the basement of the Capitol in positions of servitude.
And let's take that to its logical conclusion, which is that there was an effort by many radicals and progressives to organize these Black workers into unions that met with some success. And given the fact that these Black workers could basically stop this Capitol from functioning, this meant that the powers that be found it necessary to try to crush unions in Washington. In fact, you cannot begin to understand the Red Scare of the 1950s and the all-out attack upon unions without understanding the effort to break the back of unions in Washington, D.C., disproportionately comprised of Black workers. Now, it's not just Howard University that's serving as a beacon of higher education. However, it's also fair to say that the other universities in the district did not bathe themselves in glory when it came to combating Jim Crow. I'm thinking of George Washington University in the first instance. You might have noticed that they just changed their mascot's name from colonials to revolutionaries, where certainly it should have been changed to counter-revolutionaries, because George Washington University was a Jim Crow university for a good deal of its history, perhaps a reflection of the fact that its most famous and notorious alumnus was J. Edgar Hoover, who served as director of the federal police, the Federal Bureau of Investigation from the 1920s to the 1970s, a sworn foe of every Black leader from Marcus Garvey through Paul Robeson to Martin Luther King Jr., who you may recall he tried to induce to commit suicide. But George Washington probably has a peer in this hall of infamy when it comes to the publicly supported university, speaking of University of Maryland at College Park, supported by Black taxpayers, but fighting against desegregation tooth and nail. Catholic University, yes, Catholic University, did not necessarily embody Christian principles when it came to desegregation, nor did Georgetown University, another university started by Roman Catholics, which also fought against desegregation tooth and nail. American University, ditto. And so now you'd hardly know that because they're all preaching the liberal gospel for the most part. Now, living the liberal gospel is another story altogether.
You mentioned Howard University. We know the law school. We know the medical school, dental school. So professional schools at Howard University for African Americans, incredibly prevalent. Juxtapose that to the cafeteria workers, the working class, the poor, the Black poor. So how does that dichotomy in the context of class play itself out in the African American community in Washington, D.C.?
Oh, it plays itself out in many different ways. It plays itself out in the good offices of the NAACP, for example, which has one of its more formidable chapters in the District of Columbia. Now, since I've just done research on this question for a book I'm preparing on Washington, D.C., on Southern California, let me share with you an anecdote, which is that during the internment of Japanese Americans in California during World War II, I noticed that you mentioned Congressman Matsui, who, if I'm not mistaken, was subjected to that internment. So the NAACP in Southern California, rather than protesting against the deprivation of civil liberties of Japanese Americans, because obviously that sets a precedent for interning Black Americans, their thrust was to determine who could inherit the Japanese American businesses that were being abandoned as a result of the internment. And that particular anecdote in some ways reflects the class tension within the NAACP. And you see that also in the District of Columbia, because as I mentioned a moment or two ago, the District of Columbia is notorious for having a substantial and sizable population of Black homeless. But what's interesting is that this is nothing new. In the 1930s, the District of Columbia was notorious for having a substantial number of what were called Black alley dwellers. That is to say, people who were just staying in the elements, in alleyways, for example. And I should also mention a more favorable aspect of the NAACP history in this city, which was the struggle against Jim Crow, because the struggle to lift barriers that forbade Black people from visiting certain restaurants or checking into certain hotels.
Shopping in certain department stores.
Oh, absolutely. And, if you look at old photographs, you oftentimes see that Black people are wearing ill-fitting garments, which is a reflection of the point that they weren't necessarily able to try on the garments before they bought them. And certainly after they bought them, you couldn't return them. And so this is sort of a visual evidence of what I'm speaking about. But as we all know, with the hindsight of history, we all know now that those struggles were important. But if you did not have a job, that meant that you could enter a restaurant, but you didn't have money to pay the bill. And part of the problem with the NAACP in Washington, in fact, nationally, was that it cooperated and collaborated with the U.S. elite in helping to crush some of these left-leaning unions that were representing cafeteria workers and elevator operators, et cetera, which meant that their wages hit a ceiling, which meant that their working conditions became more oppressive. And this is a reflection of the class tension within Black Washington and reflective of the class tension that's embedded in Washington, D.C.
Dr. Gerald Horne, this is phenomenal work. Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. And, if you're looking for a book for the summer, if you're looking for a book to take with you on vacation, when you go to the beach, wherever you're going, or you're going to sit home and just chill, this right here is definitely worth the investment. And if you're a parent and you've got a high schooler that you want to give them something to challenge them with over the summer before they have to go back to school, this right here. Unless you're in Florida, of course, because is your book being sold in Florida, or has Governor DeSantis banned your book in Florida? Anyway, Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. In your chapter, Born by Revolt, you talk about 1622, when the settlers in the vicinity first came to Washington, and that they were invaders. They spent years executing depredations against unwelcoming indigents, stealing corn, torching villages. Then you talk about 1807. You compare that to the time 1807 when the colored school opened in Washington, D.C. And then you talk about the contradiction of Berry Farm in the district, which was built in 1867 when the Freedmen's Bureau bought 375 acres of Julia and David Berry's tobacco farm to sell same to African Americans to Africans migrating from plantations. And what's very interesting, because you've touched on a couple of times the homeless problem in DC. They've torn down Berry Farms, which became a housing project, and they are now supposed to be reopening such. But it's just that whole arc of history and what it represents in terms of the contradictions in the city, because before they tore down that part of the city, from say the mid 70s forward, that was not a place you wanted to spend a lot of time unless you were from that place in the city or you were planning to have problems, because that was not one of the better parts of town.
Well, what's interesting about Washington, I should say at this point, that I'm dealing with the DMV, to use the term that's often employed around these parts.
The district, Maryland, and Virginia.
And speaking of the latter, Virginia, which is, of course, just a stone's throw from Washington, the Pentagon, which soaks up a disproportionate percentage of our tax dollars, annual budget reaching towards $1 trillion, about $850 billion as we speak. One of the largest buildings in the district, if not in the United States. It was built on property that was once a thriving Black community. And of course, they were ousted. Negro removal, oftentimes disguised as urban removal, has been a theme not only of Washington, but of urban areas nationally. And then if you go through the district and wind up in Maryland, what's interesting about that is that you have this major city, Baltimore, which is, as I said, not far distant from the District of Columbia, similarly, intermittently with a Black majority, but also subjected to an atrocious Jim Crow, and as noted, with Black people barred generally from institutions of higher education, except for the ones that we now refer to as HBCUs, like Morgan State, for example, University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, for example, Bowie State, for example. But what's interesting there is how they were systematically deprived of resources. And you can say that that's still the case to a certain degree.
In fact, to that point, a lawsuit was filed, and Morgan, I think it was Morgan, or Bowie, won the suit, and then the governor decided, I'm not going to give you the money. We're going. The suit was settled about. It was a long suit. I'll say 10 years. They settled the suit about 5 years ago, and I want to say that they were. Let's say they were awarded $500 million, and the governor then decided, you know what? I'm not giving you the money. We're going to negotiate that settlement, and so. To your point about it being ongoing.
Yes, and this also raises the contradiction of the United States during this period that we're talking about, shouting from the rooftops about it being the paragon of human rights virtue, being the lodestar of democracy and human rights. But at the same time, you have these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Black people whose very existence belies that high-flown rhetoric. And in fact, that tension creates a contradiction that ultimately involves the erosion of Jim Crow, not least because of the United States' desire to put its best foot forward when it comes to the international community. And then, of course, the question today is there sufficient international pressure on the United States to keep it moving, or to help it move, I should say, in a progressive direction when it comes to anti-racism?
You mentioned a little earlier the Red Scare, and in Chapter 9, Contested Waters, Gusty Winds, you talk about Oscar Chapman, the Secretary of Interior, getting a phone call, and he was quite alarmed about a rumor of Black people planning to come into Washington and integrate the swimming pools. Why did you find that to be so significant?
Well, what's interesting about desegregation, that elongated struggle, is how swimming pools were so often a flashpoint, not only in Washington, but across the country.
In Maryland as well, all the way into the 60s.
Of course, beaches as well. And I think it has something to do with the mode in which people go to swimming pools and beaches, oftentimes, shall we say, scantily clad. And there's a real hysteria about interracial mingling across gender lines. And it was felt that desegregated swimming pools would facilitate that. And then there was just the rank racism. That is to say that if Black people got into the water, and if non-Black people also got into the same water, perhaps the non-Black people would leave the water with color, with melanin, I guess because the melanin on the Black people would wash off. And so this leads to fierce contestation, to put it mildly. It leads to near riots, in fact, not only in Washington, but nationally. In fact, books have been written about all of these struggles that took place around swimming pools and beaches. And of course, that is a subject that's worthy of further exploration.
In fact, about 2 years ago, I want to say I had someone on who wrote a book about integrating pools in Maryland. That's how I know about what was happening in Maryland, and in where I live, what is considered, what is supposed to be anyway, a fairly liberal area. But you came through here in the 60s and tried to get in a swimming pool, and you were going to have a problem on your hands. One of the things I found interesting was this description. You say, like the anti-love police, the secretary, that was Oscar Chapman, his timber narrowing, proclaimed, we had it organized to the extent that if a black boy would get amorous with a white girl or attempt to do so in any way, a black policeman would tap him on the shoulder and just quietly say, I'm a policeman. Now, we don't allow that in here in this pool. I found that to be
that anecdote also reveals and exposes one of the motivations for affirmative action in police departments. That is to say, particularly during the tumult of the 1960s and the desire to infiltrate Black protest organizations, the authorities determined that it would be easier to infiltrate these organizations with Black agents or Black cops than non-Black agents and non-Black cops. I should also say that if you look at my footnotes carefully, one of the points that emerges is that even though these manifold U.S. intelligence agencies, the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, et cetera, technically they're not supposed to operate on U.S. shores. They're only supposed to do their deviltry abroad. But it's apparent that they were operating, at least in the district, and probably nationally, in conjunction with the FBI, who of course whose mandate is domestic. And this raises very serious and searching questions about what they're up to as we speak, with regard to monitoring illicitly people and violating their civil liberties and civil rights.
You write about anti-communism leading to war, 1950 to 1951, and you quote Elgin Baylor, the great basketball player who's from Washington, D.C., and he referred to the district as Rat City. And I found this quote to be quite interesting. He said, a lot of people who grew up in D.C. at the same time as I did feel the same way. They love the people. They don't love the city. Something about it makes you uneasy. You're always looking over your shoulder.
I recommend Elgin Baylor's memoir. It's very interesting. Of course, he starred with the LA Lakers for years, a Hall of Famer. But he tells a story growing up as a young boy in the district when a carload of white men began to chase him. He was fleet of foot and he was able to elude them. But what it made me contemplate and consider was how many Black boys or girls, for that matter, were not able to elude these miscreants because they were not fleet of foot, and how many disappeared. We know about the Atlanta child murders of the 1980s, for example. What about the disappearances in the district? And then that led me to another point, which is the MK Ultra, which was a notorious intelligence experiment, which I would argue disproportionately impacted those in the district, because the district almost became sort of a laboratory for people who could fairly be termed as a Dr. Evil, who were devising all manner of experiments, oftentimes involving toxic hallucinogenics, for example. So this could be the topic for future research. Follow my footnotes, and I think you will be able to construct that next history.
We have just about 5 minutes left, and I don't think this discussion about Washington, D.C. would be correct without talking about the mayor for life, the late great Marion Barry. And I think there are a lot of people in this country that don't really understand how politically brilliant that man was, how significant that man was. All we know is, what we saw in that ill-fated evening on television. But talk about, because I will say he created the black middle class in D.C. with his use of expansion of the government and his creating jobs, and that there are, and I've seen this firsthand, there are a whole lot of folks that to this day were able to send their children to college and buy a house because Marion Barry expanded the district government and gave people jobs. You talk about how you deal with Marion Barry in the book.
His roots were in Mississippi. Of course, he's no longer in the land of the living. And then he migrates.
It'd have been a Mississippi, I believe.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And then he migrates to Nashville, where he gets involved in the movement. He's affiliated with Fisk University, historically black college there. He gets affiliated and tied to SNCC, the shock troops of the anti-Jim Crow movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And then from there migrates to Washington, still with SNCC. And then he begins to organize amongst the black unemployed, particularly black unemployed men, which then becomes a kind of launching pad for his political career. And what's interesting about Mayor Barry, as you suggested, was his ability to desegregate the workforce. Because as I said a moment or two ago, if you look at the federal workforce, for the longest, black people were absent from higher level positions. They were mostly cafeteria workers and elevator operators, and that was the same was true for the most part for the district workforce as well, the local workforce as well. That began to change big time when Mayor Barry becomes the chief executive of this city, and that wins him allegiance, I think it's fair to say, mm-hmm. that allows him to survive that ill-fated camera shot.
Escapade.
Right. Which, of course, I'm sure your audience is familiar with. Because, of course, after that, and after serving a term in prison, he's elected.
Mm-hmm.
And
reelected.
And reelected.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that many people outside of Washington were scratching their heads about that episode. But it's easy to figure out because he was associated with desegregation mm-hmm. of the labor force.
Mm-hmm.
And as you suggested, many people profited handsomely
mm-hmm.
from that desegregation. And then that wins him electoral allegiance.
For life. And again, a lot of folks didn't get it, but with my having spent the years that I have in DC and for a while kind of on the periphery of him, I saw it firsthand. Phenomenal politician. And unfortunately, there aren't many more like him. We have just about a minute. What do you want the reader to walk away from this book having a better understanding of?
Well, the importance of Washington. For example, one point that you should carry away is that anti-gentrification is important here because our federal and national opponents oftentimes are subjected to black juries because Washington, D.C. has a sizable black population. So if you chase all of the black people out of Washington, you will be chasing potential black jurors out of Washington. And I'm also trying to get the progressive movement and, in fact, the radical movement to focus more on Washington, not to see it as just another city with a sizable black population, but a city strategically to organize in and to try to build organization in.
Dr. Gerald Horne, the book, Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne. Thank you, sir. Greatly appreciated, folks.